All right, thanks everybody for joining. And so the second panel chat in our analytics and media series, if you want to call it a series with two, it's more than one, so that's something. But really excited to have the great people that we have on here today as we talk to some great journalists that cover the game of hockey and infuse a lot of data into what they do. And I think they do an exceptional job of it. So many people watching this will recognize who is on this panel here, but for those that are maybe new to this, I'll just go around and let everybody introduce themselves. So at least in my screen, at the top screen here, we've got Jason. So why don't you kick it off?
Well, it says TDB, so I don't know what I did wrong there. But yeah, Jason Gregor from TSN 1260.ca, also the Nation Network, specifically Oilers Nation. And love all sports, but I've really grown to be intrigued by what goes on with analytics.
Anybody else? Andrew?
Sure, I'll go. I'm Andrew Berkshire. I work for Sportsnet and Winnipeg Free Press using proprietary Sportlogiq data to break down the game. So my job is probably a little bit different than other people because I kind of work for like two people at the same time every time I do something. So there's a different balancing act that goes on. But yeah, I've always been passionate about sports, got into it early, and as soon as I realized that you could understand more with the numbers, I was like, well, I guess I like math now.
Ladies first, Alison.
My name is Alison Lukan with The Athletic and also the Too Many Men podcast. And it was frustration over not counting every shot that goes towards a goal that led me into my analytics journey. And I just love being able to take all the great advanced mathematically based work that's happening in our sport and be able to bounce it off of and tell stories through the eyes of the players and coaches in video to bring those numbers home to a more digestible way.
And I'm Adam Vingan, also from The Athletic. I cover the Nashville Predators, which I've been doing for the past 5+ years, with the past 2 with The Athletic. And for someone who had to repeat 11th grade math my freshman year in college, because I did not test out of it, the math portion of hockey was certainly not something that I expected to get into. But for someone who doesn't as easily understand the X's and O's of the game as others, I feel that the numbers at least help me understand system and things of that nature that allow me to explain what the Predators specifically are doing on the ice in a way that is digestible for those who are as analytically inclined as we are, as well as those who are not.
Great. Yeah. So everybody, it's interesting to hear anybody who uses this type of information, kind of why or how they got into doing it. I think a great question for anybody who uses data analytics in covering the game is, how do you do it? What methods have you found most effective? Because I know for me, it's a constant evolution. I can look back at how I started doing this years and years ago when I first began to incorporate this type of information and, what I do today. And it's a massive, massive difference. And, hopefully 5 years from now, it'll be a big difference as well. But, why don't we go back to you, Jason, to start? How do you kind of bridge that gap between using more complex information, but also making sure you're not losing people as well as you talk about the game?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mike, because I think it's a fine balance. I think one of the early criticisms of analytics was that they spoke to too small of an audience, and they almost wanted to talk down to the people because they didn't understand every formula. And the thing was, early, a lot of it was theory stuff. And like I remember my first introduction, and I wasn't one who loved analytics to begin with, to be honest. I believe that the eye test still helps. Obviously, you need both now, but Corsi I never liked from the get-go, and we've learned now that the Corsi, especially as an individual stat, really isn't, basically plus minus, right? Just a little bit more in depth. But the advancements of analytics to me has been amazing. And there's lots of different people that I read, guys who I think are probably smarter than me when it comes to analytics, excuse me. So then you can learn more. Like there's a guy in Edmonton, Darcy McLeod, Wood guy, they have Puck IQ now. And he's constantly looking. I find, you take certain things and you realize that one stat can't tell you everything. It can tell you one specific thing, but if you ever get too hung up on one, and I've learned this the hard way, you end up being wrong. So you kind of have to be more open-minded. And I think analytics overall, the presentation now, like I've read Alison's stuff and Mike yours and Andrew's, and I find the presentation of it now is not so much hamming you over the head like you're dumb if you don't understand this. This is why this element's important, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Right. I think that's actually one of my least favorite questions whenever somebody asks me about analytics is like, what's the one stat that you look at to evaluate a player? It's like, you don't. It's not like you can start with WAR, but then you have to go into what makes it up and what that player is good at and what their weaknesses are. I hate the one stat thing. So I'm glad that Jason brought that up.
Yeah, and I think too, the luxury that we all have covering teams is that what I like to do is explain what people are seeing, what happened in a game, what player is having a breakout, what is working systems wise. One of the funnest things, and not even because the outcome was to break down that Tampa Bay Columbus Blue Jackets series last year in the playoffs, because it didn't seem like it would ever happen. And so what made it happen? And, to Jason's point, when you can weave in video, when you can weave in visualization, and it's not just words that don't necessarily have a common sense meaning to the average fan, I think that makes everything so much more, not just digestible, but actually interesting.
Yeah, and I find that it is important, of course, to back up your assertions with data. Of course, that's true for any walk of life, especially ours in the journalism business. But, for example, here in Nashville, there's been a lot of attention, and rightfully so, on the season that Roman Josi had. And certainly I believe that, and I know Mike does too, because we've talked about it a lot, he should probably win the Norris Trophy this season. But, it's probably going to come down to a two-person race between Roman Josi and John Carlson. And what was interesting throughout the course of the season was, evaluating the two of them and seeing where their certain strengths and weaknesses lie. Something that Roman Josi is great at, obviously, is transitioning the puck. As Mike knows, he's the best defenseman in the league at moving the puck from one end to the other. On the other hand, John Carlson doesn't do that as much because he's not asked to do that as much because the Capitals don't play that way. So, one stat might be able to tell you part of the story, and it helps to have a full picture of what these two defensemen do and don't do well, other than just saying John Carlson had 75 points and therefore he should win the Norris Trophy. So I think it's important to provide our readers with that information and as much context as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it kind of goes back to what Andrew said as well, of there's not one thing that says, yes, this player's the best because he does this thing the best, or I don't believe one number that can really do that yet at this point in hockey. And I find, you could say, hey, Roman Josi is the best puck moving defenseman in the league. And we can back it up with, controlled exits, controlled entries, end-to-end rushes, scoring chances off the rush, whatever it might be. If you want to look at, scoring chance differentials, all that stuff doesn't necessarily make him the best though, right? He's the best at that thing, which is an important thing. But as you just said, well, how do you bring that into the rest of the equation? And so I've found, I think the more that you learn to thread things together, different metrics and data points together to help tell a whole story, the more you have to branch out to tell your story, as opposed to saying, hey, this guy's got a great percentage or differential in this thing and he must be the best. What's interesting, I think, as well, with a lot of people that infuse analytics into their coverage of the game is, and this isn't a right or wrong thing, it's kind of a personal preference, but I'd be interested to hear what everybody's view here is, number one, do you write specifically to a quote analytics crowd, or are you trying to reach a more general hockey audience? And number two, where do you stand on charts, visualizations that are a little more data heavy? Some people think, yeah, they're necessary. I need to do this to tell the story. Other people feel, hey, I may lose people if I use too much of this. How do you work to balance those things in your coverage?
Well, for me, go back and forth for article to article. I write a game day one where, so there's not a ton of analytics in that one. It's just more telling, certain matchups to expect, which I guess is a small sense of analytics. I definitely wouldn't ever write directly to the analytics crowd because I think a lot of them, know more of the stuff than I do as far as the real in-depth ones. And so that's probably a small percentage of the crowd. So I try to incorporate a little bit at a time. So you can write about this. I can, I'm an opinion guy as radio, so I'm going to express my opinion sometimes, back it up with something that I think is tangible and defensible, but then also maybe introduce a new thing that I've learned from someone else. But I also try to describe it because I think where we lose people is if, Andrew brought up war. I think there's still a lot of people that look at war and say, well, what if the second line center on said team is better than the second line center on the other team? Does that mean the first line center's war is not going to be as high? Well, I know that, but originally that's what I thought, right? So I think we always, and you're getting new people now because so many people were, I wouldn't say anti-analytics, they just didn't understand it. And so they didn't want to take the time to learn it. So we almost have to keep reintroducing. Like in radio, I have to reintroduce my guest in an interview 5 times because I might get a new listener and they're like, who are you talking to? So with analytics, I try to reintroduce and I know it gets lazy or people that know analytics like, why are you doing that? It's because I think the vast majority still don't understand what a certain stat means or what it's trying to capture.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I think in writing, it can be a bit of like the most tiring part because you feel like you're repeating yourself a lot in articles and you don't want, like, if you're asked to do an 800-word article and every single time you're spending 200 words explaining because you're using a bunch of different kinds of data, you feel like you're kind of cheaping them out a little bit. But it is something you have to do because you can't guarantee that every reader is familiar with everything. And I think that is one of the advantages of the new like microstat data that comes out now, because most things are fairly easy to comprehend. Like if I'm saying somebody took a slot shot or an inner slot shot, and those are more dangerous, it's easier to make that leap for an average reader than when we were using things like Corsi, where they're like, what does that word even mean? Or like the average hockey fan in like 2010 did not know what a Fenwick was or who Matt Fenwick was who created the statistic. It was a bigger barrier to jump through. So now I think that we're using more intuitive things that explain more of the minutia of the game. I think that's a bit of an easier jump to make. But I think like what Jason said, you always have to write for the general audience unless you're doing something that's a heavy statistical like research paper, like some of the stuff that is done over at like Hockey Graphs, where they're creating new all-in-one statistics that, they're writing paper, like academic papers on. That's not for the average fan. And I don't think we can expect the average fan to go in and read those and digest them. So it's up to us to be that facilitator to bring those metrics into the public eye and make them understandable and digestible.
Yeah, for me, I don't even like to think about it as analytics versus non-analytics. I like to think that I'm writing for the person who wants to understand more about the game. There's plenty of fans who just want to go and enjoy their beer and cheer their team, and that's amazing, and we love those people. But for people who want to get into the why or the how, that's who I write for. And I really try and steer clear of the technical names. And to your question too, I really do always try and pepper in visualizations and video because I think that when we think about the broad spectrum of communication styles that we all have, that just helps deliver the message in different ways. And I have a secret test audience in that I have to talk to players and coaches about this stuff. And I am not going to ask John Tortorella about Corsi. So, but I have to find a way to talk to them in a way that makes sense in their world. And that's my test. If I can explain it to a player or a coach and I'm speaking a hockey language, if you will, that's terminology I can use. And a quick tip I do, and I know we all do this, is always link to more resources for people who want more. And I always link to some basic stats explainers in every article at the footer. Just again, if there's that one term that caught you up, here's where you can go learn some more about that information.
It really is an interesting balance between appeasing the portion of a fan base that just eats all of this stuff up, because every team has a section of its fan base that loves this kind of stuff, and then every team has a section of its fan base that doesn't want to hear about numbers. And it always comes down to the the eye test versus the analytics, and it's best to have them work in concert versus leaning on one versus the other. And I just think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit before in terms of being able to add an extra layer to something that most people can probably see. For example, earlier this season, in a game around Thanksgiving, Victor Arvidsson suffered a pretty nasty illegal cross-check from Robert Bortuzzo and was out of the lineup for 4 to 6 weeks. He comes back and and you can just tell by watching him that he does not have that burst of speed that he was able to flourish with over the course of his young NHL career. And it's one thing to say, well, he doesn't look as fast as he did before. But if you don't believe me, or you would like more information, here are these statistics that back up that assertion. He last year was one of the most prolific scorers on the rush in the NHL, and this year he was near the bottom comparatively. So it helps, because fans in Nashville love Victor Arvidsson. He's a good player. They care about him. They can see he's not himself. He even admitted to me as such when I talked to him about it. And it's great to, sort of to Alison's point, it's great to approach players with sort of an understanding of this already. So like I was able to go up to Victor Arvidsson and already know that his rush goals were down. So I know that's something that he was probably aware of too. And it sort of cuts out the small talk. You can get right to, I know that this is something that's bothering you because you're not doing this as well as you were last year. I know you obviously know that. Why is that? It kind of cuts through the BS, for lack of a better term. So I think that really helps. It comes down to being able to satisfy the largest possible audience. And I have found here in Nashville that you have to cater to both at the same time, because there are plenty of people who like that stuff. There are plenty of people who don't like that stuff, but I think most of them are concentrated in the middle, that they are interested in both sides of the equation.
Yeah, that's interesting, because what you just laid out about Victor Arvidsson, you just told a pretty good story without using a number, right? You used analytics to get there, but it wasn't a math lesson. It wasn't number heavy. You're able to do that in a pretty succinct way that any hockey fan certainly could understand. It's funny because, I remember I think I had wrote an article and I had listed for whatever I was talking about, a top 5 list of guys that do this particular thing well. And somebody who was more analytics inclined, I guess, wrote back and said, well, why don't you show the per 60 rate to see who's really the best? Like, these are just totals, right? Now, games played get factored into that, and sure, but I'd gone and looked at it per 60. It was the same thing. I feel like as long as you don't misrepresent the data, then I try to find the simplest way to tell the story. And that's not, per 60, 5-on-5. You start to lose people, the more general crowd. So that's my personal preference. And, again, it's not necessarily a right or wrong thing, I guess. Everyone's got their own style. But Adam, you just touched on something that I wanted to ask everybody, which is, do you have examples? And I think your example was a great one. Do you have examples when you've been able to take, traditional statistics, even, but advanced statistics, and talk to a coach or a player or somebody in hockey that's helped you tell a story that maybe you wouldn't have been able to tell otherwise?
Well, having Dave Tippett in Edmonton is a real blessing if you want to talk analytics. Dave is, I don't know how many other coaches do it, but Dave literally tracks all his own stuff himself. He tracks it. He doesn't have the video guy. And the reason why, and I liked his response, he said it's for consistency, because what I deem a scoring chance, Adam and Andrew and Alison, we all might do it slightly, because he has a 1, 2, 3 that he labels as a scoring chance, 1 being the best, 2 and 3. And so he evaluates that all the time, offensively and defensively. And then he goes into which player is who's responsible for the mistake, right? Because it's kind of, you're on the ice and everybody looks at your goals for percentage. And obviously that's important, but part of that, sometimes you can do everything and you can show the video. The winger's up high. He's got his man covered. He was never at fault getting the puck out. They score twice in a game and, his goal for looks terrible. I know that they say overtime it averages out, but with Dave, I found if you dive into numbers and you bring up something, you can tell right away that he's tracked it or if he thinks he's bogus. because he doesn't. He's like, well, I think that one's really misleading based on some of the public stuff. And it's fine. It's interesting because it taught me that whoever tracks it and puts it out publicly, they're still doing it with some sort of bias. We all have a bias. So you have to interpret that and then come to it, because there was one with Matt Benning who has really good numbers when it comes to goals for against Edmonton. And he doesn't play a lot with McDavid, so you got to rule that out, because anyone who plays with McDavid usually is a little bit higher. And Matt Benning's numbers came out to be a lot better. Granted, though, limited minutes. And that's where Dave kind of hinted. He says you have to look at minutes played for defensemen, because points per, like anything per 60 can be really skewed if you don't look at a total, because the more minutes you play, it's going to be harder to maintain that rate, especially for points production, but then also to continue to push the river, if you want to call it that. So to me, what Dave was the one who pointed out how you really have to incorporate time on ice for defensemen specific if you want to look at certain statistics and their value to a team.
I mean, yeah, on the record, I don't really talk to many people in the NHL because I'm not a reporter, right? I'm just a columnist. So I don't really get to talk to them and use their words in quotes in articles. I talk to a few people, but
I like how
it's
you
usually
use
on
quotes
background.
to say
Yes,
in quotes.
in quotes,
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, so I would say like what Jason was saying, just to touch off of it, you hope that your biases in creating those metrics kind of get washed out with the larger the sample size that you gather is. But there's always some things that one way of doing it is going to be better than the other for a specific instance, like in small sample sizes, the way that coaches track scoring chances might actually be better. But then when you have a situation like that where maybe you're punishing a guy for making a mistake, but really, and most coaches probably would know this better than us, if you go 3 or 4 plays back, maybe that guy was put in that position because of somebody else's misplay. So it's like, how far back do you want to track the play? Like, could it have all started with a bad line change and that was somebody else's fault? It's not even on the ice anymore. You know, there's this huge, hockey's such a sequence sport that it's so tough to like isolate stuff outside of large sample sizes. So I think when coaches bite too hard onto like who made the mistake, you could end up punishing a guy who might just be like overly active, overly involved, right? There are some players that are very hard on the puck, that are always in the right area, but maybe make more mistakes because they're around the puck more often. And there are some players that are a lot more passive and make fewer mistakes, but also have less overall impact.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to talking to teams about analytics, there's perhaps no other type of writing or storytelling that demands that you do your homework ahead of time. Because, you know, I think to something I've loved covering for a couple of seasons now, and that's the Blue Jackets penalty kill. And John Tortorella is actually, in my mind, quite an analytical mind. He just doesn't call it by the proper terms, but he talks about, he was one of the first to talk about scoring chances. He talks about shot attempts. He talks about quality of shots. And his assistant coach, Brad Shaw, is very analytically minded, measures everything. And so to understand when the Blue Jackets were one of the first teams to really find success with this very aggressive penalty kill that we call the power kill, and to track that and to then be able to say to players, is it your goal to get the puck out of the zone? If so, how? If so, who? What are triggers for you to make that attempt? Is the goal just to dump it, or is the goal to get an offensive zone entry the other way? Having those conversations, again, backed up by the data I'd already researched, was huge. And now it's kind of fun. I get to touch base with Brad Shaw. And this year he said, you know, our goal is to not allow the opponent in the zone for more than 10 seconds at a time. So we tracked that, and they were right on. Mm-hmm. So, and I think too, when you can show that the data is applicable to how they think the game, they're willing to give you more, and your stories become even more compelling. But you must do your homework so that you know what you think you're seeing, not just data-wise, but systematically. And then you can take that into the room to the coaches and the players.
Yeah, as it turns out, the coaches aren't dumb, eh?
Right.
I find what I find interesting is talking to players about what statistics they most value, because, you know, we of course have an idea of which metrics most lead to success. But when you actually talk to a player about the ones that they measure, I mean, that can also inform your writing. For example, we were talking about WAR earlier. You know, according to the Evolving Hockey WAR metric, Ryan Ellis was the most valuable defenseman in the league this season, at least last I checked, by the end of the regular season. Now, I remember talking to him about that and him looking at me cross-eyed because he didn't quite understand what all of that meant. But then then we had a conversation about it, and I asked him about when you're looking at your own numbers or the ones that the coaching staff are coming up with, what do you look at most that lets you know what kind of job you're doing? And he mentioned, most defensemen mentioning block shots. He mentioned, he tracks, he certainly tracks, the number of, stick checks that he has, anything that measures how his stick work is. I had a conversation with Craig Smith a couple of seasons ago where he told me that the first thing that he looks on the game sheet that they get after the game is how many attempts at the net he had blocked. And he works on ways to get the puck to the net. And I found that to be very interesting. So, you can come to the players with these numbers, but it's also interesting to hear which numbers they most value so that as you're writing, you can look at the analytics that are available to us and see how well they're doing in those specific categories, as opposed to assigning them a value based on what you think is important. I also think it's important that you incorporate what they think is important as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you can learn. I know I certainly learn a lot about any angle I'm looking at from input from coaches or players. And I think it all comes back to terminology in a lot of ways, because, what Alison just talked about to me is just doing your job well. It's not, oh, I'm analytically inclined, so I do this. It's, I do my homework and I try to know what I'm talking about before I go and talk to these people. I think that's a pretty simple concept. And, whether John Tortorella, a great point she brings up, is an analytics kind of guy or not, that he thinks that way is important. Expected goals is just a kind of more granular calculation of grade A chances, which coaches have been tracking for decades. So it's that to me is just a terminology thing. We're kind of all talking the same, in the same way. It's just maybe different verbiage, I suppose. I think language is an interesting barrier to getting across to players that you're talking to. If you go to Ryan Ellis and say, hey, your WAR is really good, and he's cross-eyed, like you say. But if you broke it down as to kind of what that means, you could probably start to grasp, okay, I kind of get where you're coming from.
And that's what I did. I did the best I could to, and I've definitely leaned on Alison on this before, but, trying to say what statistics, encompass WAR. And then that's what I sort of tried to get at with him, is that these are the things it takes into account. And then from there, it sort of evolved into a deeper conversation about those specific areas, whether it was even strength defense or power play or penalty kill or what have you.
So, Adam, so the number you came up with says that Ellis was the most valuable, the best defenseman or most valuable in the league. Yet Roman Josi, most people think, is the best defenseman in the league.
Right.
It's kind of interesting when you can look at, so people are going to say, well, how is that possible? They're on the same team. Right.
They're on the same pairing.
On the same pair.
Yeah. Right? So
They're the same pair.
Some people, and it's like, I know you guys were talking earlier, it was a great point about when it comes to zone entries. If you're a defenseman on the ice with Connor McDavid, your chance of having zone entries diminishes a lot because he gets the puck all the time in the neutral zone, right? And guys like that, Crosby. So it's, Adam was wise to point out that John Carlson doesn't get asked to do things Roman Josi does because of their system. And that's the hardest thing I find when we want to compare players. It's really difficult. And at the end, we got to make it an assumption. And like Carlson and Josi most agree are 1-2 this year. And the gap between 1 and 2, it's not like it's a first liner and a fourth line center. No offense to fourth line centers. And I think that's what's unique about it. It still creates debate, but it opens up. Sometimes I find somebody, when you have a discussion, the minute that you bring up a good point in analytics, they'll try, rather than just say, okay, yeah, that's a good one. They'll try to deflect and go to something else and say, yeah, but how good could Josi be if Ellis is this good, right? And that's the hard part to define sometimes in analytics, is when you can't just focus on one thing specific and say, hey, we think he's good at this. He might not be good at something else, but that's what we're talking about right now. And that's, I find, as analytics grows, that becomes a tougher part of the conversation because there's more things that keep getting brought up in the conversation.
And Jason,
what's interesting is when, I'm sorry, Alison.
I think that's such a great point because, you look at Columbus right now, and Seth Jones has been a name that's been bandied about in a lot of conversations. people will throw out a number. Well, this, and again, it particularly for defensemen, measuring defensemen accurately is like my holy grail. But we are not recognizing the nuance in that position. And when you look at the system asks of the Blue Jackets this past season, and particularly paired with Werenski, who became a huge part of their offensive engine, the ask of Seth Jones was very specific. And you could also tell when he said, screw it, I'm going to be Seth Jones. That's back to that eye test idea. But having these nuanced conversations is so key. And I do believe people like us want to have that. We're not going to say best at zone entries, therefore best at shot attempts, therefore best. It's what's your role, what's your system, who are you playing with? There's so much nuance. And I think those conversations are so rewarding.
And to Jason's point about Yossi and Ellis, one thing that's important, and one thing that I personally take into account when evaluating Roman Yossi's season, is that Ryan Ellis missed 2 months with a concussion, or 6 weeks with a concussion. And if Ryan Ellis was, by one account, the most valuable defenseman in the league, or close to it, based on certain analytics when he was concussed, and Roman Josi continued to have a Norris Trophy caliber season with Yannick Weber as his most, it used to be Josi and Shea Weber. Now it's Josi and Yannick Weber. It's a bit of a different,
bit of a
different curve there.
No offense, Yannick.
Yes, but when Roman Josi was able to continue to have such a great year for the 6-7 weeks that Ryan Ellis was not by his side, I think strengthens his case as a Norris Trophy candidate, because he was able to continue to play well without having another elite level defenseman by his side while doing so.
Hey, Mike, can I ask you a question? And
yes, sir.
Everybody on the panel, when you look overall, because, and Andrew brought up a good point that usually, the bigger sample size, it shows things. But what happens when you notice an obvious outlier in a course of a season? Like if you look at, I'll use the Oilers because that's a team I cover more in depth. I try to look at all teams, but I know the Oilers the most. In the month of December, they were like horrifically bad, especially 5-on-5. Their penalty kill was also terrible, but their 5-on-5 play, their goaltending, their defensive play was awful. Like for 14 games, they got outscored 5-on-5, 39-18, which over a 14-game stretch is unbelievably bad. But the rest of the year, which is 81% of the season, they're like a +8 5-on-5. They're pretty consistent and competitive. So how do you take that 1 month if you were evaluating the whole season of the Oilers? And do you have time to break down a lot of teams? Because when I thought the Oilers, I'm like, well, maybe other teams, but I couldn't find a team that had a 14-game stretch that was so grossly below even average that it was hard. So you include it, but how much stock would you put in that, Andrew? I want to ask you, and then Mike, because you guys track a lot of that stuff.
Well, I think I actually wrote about that for Sportsnet while it was going on. And the main outlier that I could find was that the goaltending just went into the crapper. And, that just happens. Sometimes goalies get weird and maybe something gets tweaked and they're still playing. I know there's a goalie in Montreal who likes to play through injuries and not talk about it, and it's impacted his career in the last couple of years. But I do think sometimes things cascade. Like if something goes wrong and it goes wrong a few times, maybe a bad goal gets let up, and then the guys in front of the goaltender lose confidence and they start playing a little bit differently, and they're not used to playing that way. And it's like a ball rolling downhill, right? You can't find a way to stop it. And sometimes there needs to be a break in the schedule, or the coach needs to take everybody aside and say, listen, we need to calm down, reset everything, have a fun practice. And sometimes you can find that with analytics. And sometimes it's just crazy. Like I know the Canadians this year went on 2 streaks of like 10 losses in a row. And for at least the first one, they played pretty good hockey. Things just fell apart for them continually around the end of the game. And there were some problems that, maybe there was just something in their psyche that they were not confident that they could close out games or close out periods, but things just kept on happening to them and they kept on losing and they couldn't dig themselves out of that hole. And then eventually, one thing goes right. They get a lucky goal. They get a save at the right time. And then all of a sudden they start believing again. And this isn't very analytics, but, things start going the right way. And it's hard to explain that kind of stuff because it is random, right? And when you're evaluating a whole season, I think you have to keep that in there because it did happen, but you also have to look at what happened when they didn't have that crazy down spiral. Because not every team has a situation like that every year, but a lot of teams do have an outlier situation where things just go incredibly well, like the Buffalo Sabres a couple of years ago when they won like 10 games in a row and all by 1 goal and a bunch in the shootout. And everyone's like, oh, the Sabres are back, but they were playing pretty terrible the whole time, you know? So you have to look at those things, but the whole season, I think, bears out what a team is going to be. And if you want to get like really specific heading into the playoffs, I try to look at like the last 25 games just to see where things are heading.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact details of the Edmonton. I remember the December, the month that they had, the details that went into it. Andrew, you wrote about it, so you'd have a better idea there. The Buffalo example is a good one of really being able to know because of analytics, data, whatever you want to call it. They won 10 games in a row. Expected goal differential, they probably should have lost 7 of them. A lot of them were by a goal, overtime, whatever. They allowed more scoring chances per game in that 10-win stretch than any team in the league. So just think about that and how good the goaltending was. Like, that's right on paper. It's right there for you. And yet you still have so many people talking about, hey, they're first place. Impossible for them to miss the playoffs now. They've got this big lead, and sure enough, it crumbles. That's to me, when you've got good information where you can dig in and see that a little clearer. The Edmonton example may be a little murkier. Maybe goaltending, which can impact the game more than anything, just falls off, and yet the team still plays okay. So yeah, it's easier when there's the data there to kind of lead you in the right direction. I was talking to an assistant coach last week. He said there's nothing bigger in his view than the confidence of a player that it will affect a team's play. And you would hope that shows up then in the data. Okay, if our guys are really confident, they're buying into the system, they're playing well, then you're going to create more chances and more goals and give up less. And you hope that that's all there. Maybe over a 2-week stretch, 3 weeks, even a month, it's not showing up as clearly. So there are times, I'll be honest, when something has deviated from kind of the norm, whether it's a player or a team performance, and it's not clear. And it's hard to try to understand. That's when I go and I try to talk to people involved, and I try to, if not the player, then someone on the team or the coach, get an outside view, marry the whole thing together. But it's not always perfect. So what's interesting though is that, you know, I don't believe yet that there is a catch-all statistic that can tell me everything about a team or a player in hockey. And because of that, and we just talked about as well, how we don't really say, hey, this player has this number, or does so well in this thing, so they're the best. It requires threading together different pieces of information to come up with an analysis. And everybody's going to interpret that differently. So Andrew and I might look at the same information and have a different interpretation of what's happening. Same with Alison or Adam or Jason or whoever it is. I think that's what makes it interesting. It's still not perfect yet. Baseball is probably the closest thing to what could be perfect, just given the way the game's played, but hockey might be the farthest. And I find that interesting anyways.
Yeah, and a good example, like not to jump over anybody else, but of what you're talking about where you can't really figure out what's going wrong. Like last year, for example, John Tavares led the entire NHL in high danger scoring chances or inner slot shots, whatever you wish to call them, by like a significant margin. He was just unbelievable in front of the net, and you're like, okay, yeah, it's John Tavares. That's not a surprise. This year, the first 2 months of the year, he was nowhere to be found. Like before he went down to when he hurt his hand, he had 0 on net. And I think it was like 10 or 11 games or something like that.
Yeah, it was like a month almost. Yeah.
It was crazy how long it was. And I was like, what is going on with this guy? Is it, you know, was the hand injured before and it just got worse when he got slashed? Or was being named captain putting more pressure on him? And then, you know, even a player as good as John Tavares was having confidence issues. Like, it's so hard to figure that out. Is he being asked to do something differently because he's the captain now and he can't just sit in front of the net and wait for passes? And that's where you have to bring in what Alison and Adam and Jason do so well, where you're talking to the coaches and the players and like weaving that into, like, you use that data and you say, like, what is going on here? What's the explanation for this? And, you know, maybe it'd be tough to go to a guy like John Tavares, who is a little cagey, let's say, doesn't really say much, but maybe asking a coach or an assistant coach, like, is there something changing in the system that's putting John in a different position? Because it's really odd to see an outlier that severe for a player who's that big of a star.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, we've all touched on this. Andrew just did there again, but what we can't measure, what our numbers can't tell us yet, are systems. And they can't really tell us player fit in terms of deployment. We see some basics in terms of deployment, but we can't really measure player styles yet perfectly to say A goes with B goes with C, and that's an elite combination of player styles. And so that's something I've really tried to bring in is what is being asked of this player? How is this player being coached? How is this player being used? And laying that in with the numbers, because you're right, Mike. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as, you know, the Blue Jackets, you're watching them last year to start, they're playing, they should be winning, but they weren't. And then we find they have one of the worst shooting percentages in the league since the last lockout. So that's easy. But then you have the Blue Jackets power play, which has been abjectly bad for 3 years. They've literally tried every personnel combination, every system, different coaches, and it still struggles. And that's where sometimes you're just like, I don't know. And you just have to keep digging at numbers, coaching, staff, systems, all of it together to see if there's anything you can find.
Well, they obviously don't know, right? So I mean,
exactly.
it'd be something if we knew. It'd be pretty impressive.
Well, Mike,
They're paying you a lot of money.
I remember a few years ago when the Predators won the President's Trophy, which was in 2017-18. Near the end of the season, they went on a 10-game winning streak. And I remember watching that 10-game winning streak. They were winning a lot of really close games and games that the numbers would suggest they probably shouldn't have won. And I remember at the time, you know, the sense was, well, they're the best team in the league. They're winning 10 games in a row. That's probably what they should do. But I remember being a bit skeptical of that winning streak. And then as the playoffs started, they had their hands full with Colorado in the first round, and of course a 7-game series with the Winnipeg Jets. And after the season was over, I kind of went back to that 10-game winning streak. And a lot of it was smoke and mirrors. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I remember even thinking at the time, like, the record is good. It's great to win 10 games in a row at any point of the season, but they didn't really look good doing it. They weren't dominant by any imagination. And I think that sort of informed what ended up happening in the postseason, where they didn't look as formidable as everyone thought they would be.
Now, well, confidence is the one thing that's impossible to track. But you can see it when you just see players making plays, but you talk to coaches, you talk to their teammates, and I've seen guys who are elite goal scorers, and so they lose confidence. So you imagine if an average player loses confidence to the point where, and it's simple as just, you know, you can't connect a pass. And Alison talked, I would guess that the Columbus Blue Jackets players, doesn't matter which one, they don't have much confidence in their power play. And maybe it hurts if they go against, you call it their power kill in practice all the time, because if you never have any confidence in practice because the penalty kills crushing you. Like simple, like I know goaltenders have told me they would purposely allow one of their goal scorers to score in practice a few times if he was struggling, because they wanted him to feel like, oh, hey, I just beat our starting goalie a few times. Now the goalie's like, I could have made the save, but I want him in his head to think he can score.
Yeah, that's interesting. It has to be, there are a lot of things I think that we can't quantify maybe at all, or certainly perfectly quantify, that are important. Overall, it's I guess you can tie analytics into this, but even just an overall coverage of the game, do you feel at times that there can be an overvaluing of what we know or what we believe we know, slash a not good enough understanding of what we don't know? Because there are, you know, whether it's an opinionist or an analytics specialist, a lot of people in hockey media, hockey Twitter, as we all know, are happy to say, hey, boom, boom, and then this is it, guaranteed. When I think there is, as Alison and others have brought up, a lot more nuance that goes into it. Do you think that maybe one of the barriers to analytics is, in terms of the general population, is maybe an overconfidence in the information that is currently available?
I don't know, because I think that before that, there was already an overconfidence in, you know, certain sectors of the media or fans before the numbers came in and like what they know, right? Like, I think that was one of the things that, like, when the analytics community started becoming more mainstream, one of the big barriers was that the analytics community was very confident, and then everyone who didn't want them to be involved was also super confident that it was wrong. You know, like, oh, this is garbage. And it just created this vitriol between the two sides that really never should have existed in the first place. And I feel like that's just what happens when any status quo is challenged. Anybody who comes up with something is going to be confident in what they came up with. They'll try to defend it as strongly as they can. Especially in academic circles, right? They call it a thesis defense to get to your higher education. Like, you have to defend it. So I think that maybe there's a difference between being defensive and defending something. And that comes probably more with maturity. And a lot of the analytics crowd starts out younger. It's a way for younger people to get into the game. If you have something interesting to say, you can kind of create it yourself and just throw it out into public and people will comment on it. So it becomes I think the two biggest sides are the younger people trying to get in, and not to be ageist, but the older people who are close to the way out, who don't want things to change underneath them, right? Who the people who don't want to change. I think that's where the big conflict is. But I think everything is getting better. Twitter is a cesspool, and it always will be. But I think if you take what you have and kind of ignore the worst of it on both sides, it's still a good medium. And for the most part, I think that we're in a good spot.
To me, the most enlightening maybe interview I've had in the last few years was with Rob Volman, who of course is a longtime analytics guy, now works for the LA Kings. And he wasn't working for the Kings at the time, and he was very forthcoming. And he's calculated lots of statistics, and he said, because, and I think Andrew's bang on, is there's people that will just, anybody who tries to say, hey, this is what it says, so it has to be 100% true. Well, obviously that's not the case. But Rob came up with a number. He felt there was still 39% of the game that's basically luck and unpredictable. It doesn't matter what system, it doesn't matter what analytics you do. And that's still a massive part of the game. So a team could play really well, play their system to a T, have all the players in the right place. All of a sudden, they pass the puck, it hits off a partition, goes into the slot, guy scores 3-2, right? And in the game of hockey, it's so fast that I think when he put that number, and I don't know how accurate it was, but I kind of trust Rob because he's done years of studying on it. And he said it kind of frustrated him because there was still that much left. And he goes, I'm not sure we'll ever get that much closer to it because the game itself, there's so many unpredictable events in a game that you can't quantify it. You can hope to get close, but at the end of the day, you always have to say, there's a portion of this thesis that in hockey, I just can't predict. And I can't even say with accuracy how accurate it would be. And that to me was like, okay, good. Now I can breathe. I'm a numbers guy, really. So I put a number to it. Now I don't have to get too upset either way if I think something and all the numbers prove it. Then I'm like, yeah, but there's 40% that might totally screw that up, even if they do everything right.
Yeah, I think this is where it's so important to, and I can't remember who said this earlier, but we do need to look at other sports to realize how nascent this work is in the hockey space. I mean, we're doing great stuff, but there's still so much to do. And I like to have fun with some of those people. Someone earlier this year said, expected goals, what does that mean? That means nothing. I said, a goalie doesn't literally stand on his head, but that's what you say all the time. Like, we make these things up and they're silly. But I do think too, something that I run up against that I think is important. We've talked about learning how to use numbers, learning to accept the lack of total confidence sometimes because it's the nature of the sport. But also, this is math, right? This is probability-based stuff. And so particularly when it comes to what fans care about, which is wins and goals, this is math. So it's just like flipping a quarter. You've got a 50% chance of getting that heads or tails, but that doesn't mean that every other time is heads or tails. Yeah. And so bringing in that little baby bit of math, or at least really presenting, using words like probability, possible, expected to, we need to be responsible to what these numbers don't just represent in terms of what happened on the ice, but what they actually represent in measuring the game when we use them, I think.
And one of the things that I like, oh, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I echo everything everybody is saying. Of course, as we were having this very informative discussion, the Predators decided to be the last team in the NHL to announce their training camp roster. So, just making sure I had it all under control.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, what I was going to say, just jumping off of Alison, was one of the things that I like on Twitter is Dom Lucian's, when he does his predictions on like who's going to win tonight. And I always check the replies after the games are over, because he'll post like, the Columbus Blue Jackets have a 51.7% chance of beating the Toronto Maple Leafs, and then the Leafs will win in like overtime, and a bunch of people are like, "You idiot! You picked this wrong! You moron!
Yes.
What are you doing?" And it's like you realize the confidence interval is minuscule, right? Like he wasn't advising people to bet that way.
Right. So
People
true.
were even upset with Dom about the simulated playoff series we did during the pause. Like the Predators played the Blues in the first round, and his analytics had the Predators winning the series. And there was like 200 comments, like 187 of which were from Blues fans. Like, didn't you watch the Stanley Cup playoffs last year? We're just trying to find a way to kill time. So I don't envy Dom at all. You know,
I think we're all happy that hopefully we're going to get games pretty soon that we can talk about and get away from all this hypotheticals. We're running up on close to an hour here, which time flies. It's an interesting discussion. So let's just go around the horn here because Alison, you cover Columbus, and Adam, Nashville, and Jason, Edmonton, and Andrew, you do a bit of everything, but Canadian teams, Montreal heavy as well as Winnipeg. In your markets, as we approach the qualifying round, what are some of the things, whether it's based on numbers in general, that you're looking forward to? Have you dove into the playoff matchups yet, respectively? Do you see kind of advantages, mismatches, interesting storylines? When we start with Jason and Edmonton.
Yeah, well, I think the Oilers, their fan base here in Edmonton, and they've been beaten down for a long time, so they don't. You see one little negative thing, and it's almost like it's a reoccurring nightmare. So they don't want to see it, and I get it, right? When you're like, the Oilers have been historically bad for a long time. So the thing is, I think the Oilers are actually way better than a lot of people give them credit. If you look, and I agree with Andrew, a lot of teams, I went back over the last 10 years, teams playing well leading into the playoffs is usually a good sign of what happens. Now, St. Louis was obviously, a massive, a little bit different, but the Edmonton Oilers had the 5th most points, the 5th best points percentage. They had the 2nd most goals, the 10th fewest goals against. Their power play is ridiculous. Their penalty kill is good. Even their goaltending was solid. So I actually think the Oilers are a lot better than people think. And it helps when they've got the 2 most dynamic offensive players on separate lines now. So really the only question in Edmonton, a lot of people are, what about goaltending? It's a huge one. But, Mike Smith, he didn't have great numbers, but the team won. And so that's where you come down to at the end of the day for coaches. It's like, does he give him a different confidence with his ability to play the puck and things like that? Or was when Mikko Koskinen was in net and he had a .929 save percentage down the stretch, but the team couldn't score a goal to save his life, right? So you don't know, like in all the numbers suggest Koskinen's been playing better. But Mike Smith, when he's in, they win. And he's a real vocal guy in a quiet dressing room. So I don't know. I can't make sure the connection between the two, but that I think is the biggest question. And who's going to play left wing with McDavid? So who gets the golden ticket opportunity in the postseason?
Yeah, well, what's interesting there is that if I think you could, as you mentioned, Koskinen better numbers overall, but Smith's. If you want to use what I did when I viewed these playoff series as an attempt to quantify maybe what could happen with these goalies, is how do they play in their first 5 games of the season after the summer layoff? Massively imperfect, but I don't really know where else to go with that to try to figure it out. So Smith was good. And then you think about the playoffs he had for Calgary against Colorado. He was unbelievable. Does that tip a scale versus kind of Koskinen's better overall year? There's not a perfect answer, right?
Mike, who the coach likes, I think, is going to be. I'll be stunned if Mike Smith isn't the goalie for game 1. And I get it. Like, everybody has it. Dave Tippett's going with the guy who he knows, he trusts. He's highly competitive. And he's really added juice to the locker room. He really has. Like, when he got in that fight, like, it was, I know it sounds archaic and people are like, fighting's too bad, but I'm telling you, emotion's a major part of it. And their team was still buzzing weeks later because of it. And I think Mike Smith adds up. They have confidence in Koskinen, and I think you'll see both, but I'll be stunned unless Smith is, because he hasn't been on the ice very much and that's the only thing that might have him not playing. Otherwise, I think he starts game 1 and he'd have to play pretty bad not to be there for game 2.
I swear, even the most ardent anti-fight people are like, a goalie fight?
I'm down for goalie fights. Absolutely. The Buffalo, I think it was MSG on social media, put out kind of a 12-minute recap of the fight against the Senators when Emery and Marty Biron fought. And they had Marty talking about it and Andrew Peters. And those guys got so fired up just watching that video again. It's funny to see. Alison, what about Columbus? What are you looking at?
Yeah, it's funny. Actually, it's going to just be interesting to see this team healthy again. They led the league in man games lost. And it's going to be curious because they found more success as their roster got more depleted, strangely enough. So I'm really curious to see how this group performs at full health. They need, I talked about that power kill, they need that back. They were so depleted, it became a penalty kill. It lost the power kill edge. And they need that to go against an offensive powerhouse like Toronto. So the quick headline that everyone's saying is actually true. It's this staunch, effective defensive forecheck that Columbus put in place. How quickly can they get back to it? Looking at those micro stats, looking at shot quality, because it's interesting. They'll allow shot volume, but not shot quality. So can that defense key in? We know how talented Toronto is. Everyone wants to talk about Columbus goaltenders. I get it. But the defense in front of them has been such a key for them this year that I think that the coaching staff will make the right choice. I'm more interested in that defense and that forecheck executing.
Yeah, they did a lot of that against Tampa Bay, right? And I think in a real simplistic way, you could kind of look at Toronto as a Tampa Bay light, very similar, but maybe not quite the same elite talent Tampa Bay has. But you know what's an interesting wrinkle is that all of these play-in rounds have one back-to-back in every series, and some of them are games 4 or 5.
Yep.
So you'd think with maybe Edmonton, who's got 2 capable goalies, Columbus, who does, Toronto, not so much. Will that be an advantage if teams can go one guy, another guy, instead of like a Carey Price in Montreal, where you'd think he'd probably go both games? And in Nashville, Adam, is it Pekka Rinne? Is it UC Saros? I did an article on Saros.
Question for sure.
He's the littlest goalie in the league, but he plays so big. And then you've got Rinne, who's so big, but didn't have a great year. What else is going on?
That is the biggest thing for sure. If you look at their numbers from the time of the coaching change, which was January 7th, by a variety of statistics, UC Saros was one of the best goaltenders in the league, and Pekka Rinne was one of the worst. And UC started 15 of the Predators' final 21 games. And you mentioned the back-to-backs, Mike, which is very interesting. The Predators' back-to-back situation is games 2 and 3. So, some teams have it where it's only if the series goes longer than 3 games, whether it's game 4 or game 5. The Predators Coyote series has the back-to-back in games 2 and 3. So they're starting their series with 3 games in 4 days. Now, under normal circumstances, you split the goaltending load in that case. And, whether or not the, Pekka Rinne or UC Saros starts game 1, I mean, the next goalie could come up in game 2 or 3, but it is a big deal. It will be a big deal if UC Saros starts game 1, just because Pekka Rinne has started 89 consecutive playoff games for the Predators. The last goaltender to start a game for the Predators in the playoffs was Dan Ellis, and that was 12 years ago. So the only goaltender who has started more consecutive playoff games active than Pekka Rinne is Henrik Lundqvist, whose streak may also be in jeopardy for the New York Rangers. So even if, let's just say, UC Saros starts game 1 and then the 2 goaltenders split games 2 and 3, if UC is in net for game 1, that's a big deal. The other thing I'm looking forward to is just seeing how the Predators continue to adapt to John Hines' system, just because they didn't really have a lot of time to do so when the coaching change was made in January. And I know that this pause has been incredibly important for John Hines and his staff in getting to know the players and further implementing his vision on the team. So that's another aspect that I'm looking for. But UC Saros versus Pekka Rinne is the preeminent storyline for sure.
Yeah. Andrew, we'll give you the last word here. We're at about an hour already. So
sure. I'll try to wrap it up.
Go ahead.
Hey guys, sorry, I got to run because the new protocol. There's only an open window when I get in the rink, so I gotta bug out to get there. So
go do actual work.
Yeah, Andrew.
I'm headed there myself after I'm done here.
Same.
Hey, thanks guys. Thanks, Alison.
Okay, Andrew, why don't you wrap real quick and then we'll.
All right. So the thing I'm looking forward to is just kind of testing a couple theories, right? Because we don't really know how this is going to play out, and I think with the lack of practice time that coaches have with teams, I wonder if it's going to be a situation where teams that are more reliant on elite talent do better than the teams who are reliant on, like executing a system perfectly, because we're going to have a little bit more messiness at the beginning, and it's harder to really drill things in this, not only not having a lot of practice time, but also you have limited amount of players that you can have on the ice at the same time. So I do wonder if that's a situation where we get. And the other thing I want to look at is officiating. How is the NHL going to handle that? Because at the beginning of the season, obviously there's a big crackdown every year, right? You get more goal scoring, more penalties, and then it kind of dwindles all year, every month, until we get to the playoffs where almost nothing's called. Are they going to try to crack down to try to send a message at the beginning? Or is it going to be playoffs as usual and we'll get sloppy hockey with no penalties and lots of cheating? And who knows what will happen then? So I think it's really interesting to test those things out, but I have no idea what to expect.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing about, we all try to quantify things and understand the best we can. And this thing can be an absolute something show. I don't want to say the word, but nobody has any idea what's going to happen. But anyways, look, I really appreciate everyone taking the time. And I think it was a really interesting discussion. Always enjoy reading your work. Even though we all use data in some way or another, everyone approaches it differently. So thank you very much for coming on. And like I said, hopefully we have games to talk about soon, and hope everyone stays healthy.